Your son is still alive. Daniel Carter turned sharply at the small voice behind him. The old photograph slipped from his fingers and fell onto the grass beside the headstone. What did you just say? He asked slowly. Your son, the girl repeated. He's still alive. Daniel frowned, then pointed at the grave beside him, his voice tightening. Are you joking? Do you not see my son's name on this headstone? Ethan Carter. That's my boy. He died last year. I was overseas on a business trip when it happened. My sister called me and told me he got very sick very fast. By the time I got back, everything was already over. The funeral had already happened. They told me it was better I didn't see him like that. He swallowed. So don't stand there and tell me my son is alive when his name is carved in stone. The little girl didn't look scared. She stepped closer instead, looking at the grave, then back at him. My granddaddy says names on stones don't always mean the person is really there, she said quietly. Daniel frowned, studying her now. And who are you? Daniel asked. And why are you here talking to me about my son? My name is Annie, she said. My granddaddy takes care of this cemetery. I come here after school sometimes. She looked at the grave again, then at Daniel. I seen you here before. Daniel frowned. You have? She nodded. Yes, sir. You always come alone. You stand here a long time. Sometimes you talk. She hesitated, then added softly, You always talk to this grave. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't realized anyone had ever seen him do that. Before he could answer, Annie bent down and picked something up from the grass. You drop this, she said. She held up the photograph. Daniel reached for it, but Annie looked at the picture first. She studied it carefully, her eyes moving from the man to the little boy sitting on his shoulders. This is him, she said. That's the boy who lives with us. Daniel froze. Give me that. She handed him the photo, then quickly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another photograph, slightly bent and kept inside a small plastic sleeve. My mama told me to bring this, Annie said, in case I saw you again. Daniel took the second photo. It showed a small living room with old furniture and a thin little boy standing barefoot on a worn rug, holding a grilled cheese sandwich and smiling a shy, careful smile. His hair was longer, his face a little thinner, but there was no mistake. It was Ethan. Daniel's hands began to shake. That picture was taken in our house, Annie said. He's been living with us almost a year now. My mama found him behind the grocery store last winter. He was real sick and real scared. He kept saying his name was Ethan and his daddy was Daniel Carter. Daniel could barely breathe. That's not possible, he whispered. My son died. There were papers, a death certificate, a funeral. That funeral was a lie. Daniel turned at the sound of the older voice and saw an elderly black man walking toward them, holding his work hat in his hands. Granddaddy, Annie said. I told him. The old man nodded and walked up beside the grave. His eyes moved from the headstone to Daniel's face. Mr. Carter, he said gently, my name is George. I take care of this cemetery. Daniel said nothing. He was still holding both photographs, staring at the face of the boy in the second picture. George continued, his voice calm but firm. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Your son is not buried here. Daniel looked up slowly. What did you say? This grave, George said, tapping the ground lightly with the toe of his boot, is empty. Daniel stared at him. No. That's not possible. My sister and her husband arranged everything. They told me the hospital handled the body. They told me the coffin was sealed because he was too sick at the end. They told me everything was taken care of. George nodded slowly. Your brother-in-law is the one who came here with the coffin. Said it was a private burial. Closed casket. Paid cash. Told me not to open it. He paused, then looked Daniel straight in the eyes. I've buried people for over 30 years, Mr. Carter. I know how heavy a coffin is supposed to be. That one was too light. Daniel felt the world go very quiet. I didn't say anything at the time, George said. But I never forgot it either. The boy is living in our house. Annie pointed to her own eyebrow. He got a small scar right here, she said. He told me a dog scratched him when he was little, and it left that little mark. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The scar. Ethan had been scratched by a neighbor's dog when he was 4. It had left a small, thin mark, hidden in his eyebrow. Very few people knew about that. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he looked at the headstone, then at the photograph in his hand, then at Annie and her grandfather. For 1 year, he had been coming to this place to talk to his son. Now he understood the truth. He had not been standing at his son's grave. He had been standing in front of a lie. Daniel slowly folded the photograph and held it tightly in his hand. Then he looked at Annie, his voice low and steady now, but filled with something new, something that had not been there for a very long time. "If my son is alive," he said, "I need you to take me to him." Annie looked up at him and nodded once. "Yes, sir," she said. "I will." Daniel Carter walked beside Annie as they headed toward the rusted iron gate at the edge of the cemetery. He stopped just before they reached the gate. "Annie," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "Before we go any further, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. No skipping parts." Annie looked up at him and nodded. "My granddaddy used to work nights sometimes," she began, "cleaning up around the cemetery, fixing the fences, mowing when it got too long. One night last winter, my mama went to pick him up after her shift at the diner. I was in the car with her. They stepped out onto the sidewalk. The town beyond the cemetery was old. The kind of place where storefronts still had hand-painted signs and people still waved to each other from porches. My mama stopped at the grocery store before we went to get granddaddy," Annie continued. "When she came out, she heard something behind the building, like someone coughing, not normal coughing, the kind that hurts." Daniel listened without interrupting, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his mind trying to move carefully, logically, even though his heart was beating too fast. "She found him behind the trash bins," Annie said. "He was hiding. He thought she worked there and was going to send him back. He tried to run, but he was too weak." Daniel stopped walking for a moment. "He tried to run?" Annie nodded. "He said he didn't want to go back to the place with the white walls and locked doors. He said they told him his daddy didn't want him anymore." Daniel looked away toward the street, jaw tightening. "What did your mother do?" he asked. "She brought him home," Annie said simply. "We don't got a lot, but my mama says you don't leave a child in the cold. He was real sick that first week, fever and coughing. Granddaddy went and got medicine, and my mama made soup and made him sleep in my bed. I slept on the couch." They started walking again, turning down a street where the houses grew smaller and closer together. "When he got better," Annie continued, "he told us his name was Ethan. He said his daddy's name was Daniel Carter. My mama thought maybe he was just saying things because he was scared, but then one night he started crying and saying he wanted to go home, and he kept saying your name over and over." Daniel's throat felt tight. "Did he ever say anything about his aunt or his uncle?" Annie thought for a moment. "He said a lady told him his daddy was too busy for him now, that his daddy had important work and didn't have time for a sick kid. He said they told him he was going somewhere new where people would take care of him." Daniel stopped walking again. That sounded like Sarah. It sounded like something she would say in that soft voice of hers when she wanted someone to believe something that wasn't true. He felt anger begin to move slowly through his chest, not loud, not wild, but cold and steady. "How long has he been with you?" Daniel asked. "Almost a year," Annie said. "Since the snow was on the ground. A year, a whole year his son had been alive in this same state, breathing the same air, sleeping under someone else's roof, thinking his father had abandoned him." Daniel pressed his lips together and kept walking. "Does he know I'm coming?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "No, sir. I didn't tell him. I wasn't sure if you were a good man or not." Daniel looked down at her, surprised. "You weren't?" She shook her head again. "Some kids got daddies with big houses and big cars and still don't come home. Money don't always mean good." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "That's true," he said. They walked another block in silence before Daniel spoke again. "Why did you decide to tell me today?" Annie kicked a small rock on the sidewalk as she walked. "Because last week I heard him crying again," she said. "He thought nobody heard him, but I did." He said, "I think my dad forgot me." Daniel stopped walking. The words hit him harder than anything else he had heard so far. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you believe in stories about justice, love, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. "I didn't forget him," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I was lied to." Annie looked up at him. "Then you should tell him that yourself," she said. They turned onto a narrower street now, where the pavement was cracked and the houses leaned slightly with age. A few cars sat in driveways that had more dirt than concrete. Somewhere nearby, a screen door slammed and a dog barked once, then went quiet. Annie pointed ahead. "That blue house," she said. "The one with the crooked porch. That's where we live." Daniel looked at the house. The paint was peeling, and the porch did lean slightly to one side. There was a small plastic tricycle in the yard and a line of laundry hanging in the back. It was nothing like the house Daniel owned. And yet, for the first time in a year, he felt like he was standing in front of the place where his son actually was. Before they reached the steps, Annie stopped and turned to him. "Mr. Carter," she said. "When you see him, he might not run to you." Daniel felt his chest tighten again. "Why not?" "Because he thinks you didn't come for him," she said. "And when kids think that for a long time, they build a wall in their heart. My granddaddy says grown men do that too." Daniel looked at the small house, then down at Annie. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "But I'm still going to knock on that door." Annie nodded. Then she walked up the steps and opened the screen door. Inside the house, Daniel could hear the sound of a television playing softly and the faint clatter of dishes in a kitchen. Inside that house was his son. Daniel stood on the small wooden porch, looking at the faded blue door in front of him. Up close, he could see where the paint had peeled away over the years, where the wood had been patched and repainted, where someone had tried to take care of this place, even without much money. From inside came the soft sound of a television and the faint smell of something cooking onions, maybe, and butter. It smelled like a home where people ate dinner together at the same table every night. Daniel realized he was nervous, not the kind of nervous he felt before signing a contract or walking into a room full of investors. This was different. This was the kind of nervous that lived in your chest and made every second feel longer than it should. Annie pushed the screen door open and stepped inside. She turned back and looked at him. "You coming?" she asked. Daniel nodded once and stepped in. The living room was small but clean. An old brown couch sat against the wall with a crocheted blanket folded over the back. A coffee table with a few scratches stood in front of it. And on the far wall, a television played a daytime game show at low volume. The carpet was worn but vacuumed, and on one side of the room there was a small shelf filled with children's books and a few toys. One of those toys was a small red boat. Daniel saw it immediately. It sat on the shelf next to a box of crayons, the red paint chipped slightly on one side. His chest tightened. A woman in her 30s stepped out from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. She stopped when she saw Daniel, her eyes moving quickly from his face to his coat, his shoes, then back to his face again. "Annie," she said slowly. "Who is this?" Annie walked over and took the woman's hand. "Mama," she said. "This is Mr. Carter, Ethan's dad." The woman went very still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the woman nodded once, like she had been expecting this day for a long time. "I was wondering when you would come," she said quietly. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, his voice steady but low. "And I think you have my son." The woman looked at him carefully, like she was measuring something in his face. After a moment, she nodded again. "My name is Lillian Miller," she said. "And yes, your son has been living in this house for almost a year." Daniel let out a slow breath, like he had been holding it since the cemetery. "Where is he?" Daniel asked. Lillian glanced toward the hallway. "He's in the back room, doing homework." Daniel felt his heart begin to pound again. Lillian held up a hand gently. "Before you go in there, I need to tell you something, Mr. Carter." Daniel looked at her. "When we found him, he was sick, underweight, and he didn't trust adults very much," she said. "Not because he was a bad kid, because someone had told him a story for a long time, and he believed it." "What story?" Daniel asked quietly. "That his father didn't want him anymore," she said. "That his father had a new life, and didn't have time for a child who was always sick." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second. "That's not true," he said. "I believe you," Lillian said, "but he doesn't know that yet. So when you walk into that room, don't walk in like a rich man who came to fix a problem. Walk in like a father who came to see his son." Daniel nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. Lillian turned and walked down the hallway, then stopped at a half-open door and knocked lightly. "Ethan," she said, "there's someone here to see you." A small voice answered from inside. "Okay," Lillian opened the door and stepped aside. Daniel walked down the hallway slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. A small desk sat by the window. On the desk were a few school books, a pencil, and a piece of paper with spelling words written carefully in a child's handwriting. Sitting at the desk, focused on the paper, was a small boy with dark blonde hair. He looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel saw it immediately: the eyes, the shape of his face, the small line on his chin when his mouth tightened slightly in concentration. The same boy from the photograph. The same boy he had taught how to tie his shoes, how to hold a baseball bat, how to brush his teeth without making a mess. The same boy he had believed was dead. Ethan looked at him. Not scared, not crying, just looking, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Daniel didn't move closer right away. He remembered what Lillian had said, so he spoke first, and he spoke gently. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said. The boy's eyes changed at the sound of that word, buddy. Daniel had called him that since he learned to walk. Ethan stood up slowly from the chair. They stood there, a few feet apart, looking at each other. Daniel could see the questions in the boy's eyes, questions a 6-year-old should never have to carry. So Daniel did the only thing he could do. He told the truth. "I didn't know where you were," he said. "I thought you were gone. I thought I lost you. If I had known where you were, I would have come the first day. Not a year later. The first day." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked one question. "You didn't leave me?" The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a whole year. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I did not leave you. I was lied to. And I am so sorry it took me this long to find you." The room was very quiet. Then Ethan walked the few steps between them and stopped right in front of Daniel. He looked up at him carefully, like he was checking if this was real. Daniel did not rush him. He did not grab him. He just stood there. After a moment, Ethan reached out and took hold of the sleeve of Daniel's coat, like he was testing whether the man in front of him would disappear if he let go. Daniel placed his hand gently over his son's small hand. "I'm here now," Daniel said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." In the hallway behind them, Annie stood next to her mother, watching quietly. Lillian put a hand on Annie's shoulder and whispered, "Sometimes the world hides the truth from people." Annie looked at Daniel and Ethan standing in that small room. "Yeah," she said softly, "but sometimes the truth finds its way home anyway." Daniel did not remember walking back into the living room. One moment he was standing in the small bedroom, looking at his son's school books and the careful way Ethan had written his spelling words. The next moment he was sitting at the Miller family's kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him that he had not seen Lillian pour. Across from him, Ethan sat quietly eating a grilled cheese sandwich, the same way he had in the photograph. Annie sat beside him, swinging her legs under the chair, watching Daniel with open curiosity, like she was trying to understand what kind of man he really was. Lillian sat down at the table and folded her hands. "We should talk," she said gently. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. "We should." He looked at Ethan first. "Buddy, why don't you and Annie finish eating in the living room for a bit? I need to talk to Miss Lillian." Ethan looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." He picked up his plate and walked into the living room with Annie. And Daniel watched the way he walked. The way he held the plate carefully with 2 hands. The way Daniel had taught him when he was smaller. When they were alone, Daniel looked at Lillian. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the moment you found him." Lillian nodded slowly. "I already told Annie's granddaddy most of it, but you deserve to hear it yourself." She took a sip of coffee, then began. "The night we found him, he was hiding behind the grocery store, like Annie told you. He was sick and scared, but he was polite, kept saying yes ma'am and no ma'am. That told me right away he hadn't grown up wild. Someone had raised him right." Daniel swallowed slightly. "He didn't trust us at first," Lillian continued, "but he trusted Annie. Kids trust other kids faster than they trust adults. After a few days, he started talking more. He told us about you, about the big building you worked in, about the red boat, about how you used to read to him at night even when you were tired." Daniel looked down at the table. "He never said anything bad about you," Lillian said. "Not once. Even when he thought you didn't come for him. He just kept saying, 'My dad is busy. He'll come when he's done working.'" Daniel pressed his lips together and nodded once, slowly. "Did he tell you anything about where he was before he ran away?" Daniel asked. Lillian nodded. He said it was a place with white walls and locked doors. Said there were other kids there. Said they told him he was sick and his father couldn't take care of him anymore. Said a man and a woman came to see him once and talked to the people there for a long time. After that, the staff started treating him different, like he wasn't staying long. Daniel felt anger begin to rise again, slow and controlled. A man and a woman, Daniel repeated. Did he say what they looked like? He said the woman looked like you, Lillian said carefully. Same eyes, same hair color. He said she hugged him, but she was crying. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. Sarah, and the man? Daniel asked. He said the man was always on the phone and didn't talk to him much, Lillian said. Just told the staff to make sure the paperwork was done right. Victor. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was no doubt left in them. They told him I didn't want him anymore, Daniel said quietly. Lillian nodded. Yes, she said. That's what they told him. Daniel sat there for a long moment, staring at the table, seeing not the wood grain but 100 small memories of his sister Sarah at 10 years old, borrowing his books, Sarah at 16 asking him for help with math, Sarah standing next to him at his wedding, Sarah holding Ethan when he was a baby. Family. He had trusted family more than anyone, and that had been his mistake. What do you want to do now? Lillian asked gently. Daniel looked toward the living room, where he could hear Annie explaining the rules of some board game to Ethan. I'm taking my son home, Daniel said. But I'm not taking him away from the people who saved his life. Lillian said nothing. Daniel looked back at her. You fed him. You took care of him when he was sick. You gave him a place to sleep when he had nowhere to go. I don't forget things like that. We didn't do it for money, Lillian said quickly. I know, Daniel said. That's why I'll never forget it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. This is my direct number, he said. Not my office. Not my assistant. Me. If you or Annie or your father ever need anything, you call that number. Lillian looked at the card but didn't pick it up right away. We're not charity, Mr. Carter, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. I know, he said. You're family now. That was when Annie and Ethan walked back into the kitchen. Ethan looked between Daniel and Lillian. Am I going with you? He asked. Daniel looked at his son carefully before answering. Yes, he said, but not today if you don't want to. We'll do this the right way. You'll come see my house first. You'll see your room. And you can come back here anytime you want. This place isn't being taken away from you. Ethan thought about that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. Annie looked at Daniel. You got a big house? She asked. Daniel almost smiled. Yeah, he said. It's pretty big. Annie nodded seriously. Ethan should still come here sometimes, she said. So he don't forget how normal people live. Lillian covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Daniel looked at Annie and said, That might be the smartest thing anyone said to me in a long time. Then Ethan asked the question Daniel had been expecting. Who told me you didn't want me? Ethan asked. Daniel looked at his son, and for a moment he considered lying, considered saying something simple. Something that would protect the boy from the ugliness of the truth. But lies were the reason they were here in the first place. So Daniel told the truth. Your Aunt Sarah and Uncle Victor, he said. They told people I didn't want you anymore. They told me you were sick and gone. They lied to both of us. Ethan didn't cry. He didn't look scared. He just looked down at the table and thought about it in that serious way children sometimes do when they are trying to understand adult problems. After a moment, he looked back up at Daniel and asked, Are they in trouble? Daniel held his son's gaze. They will be, he said. Because what they did was wrong. And in this family, we tell the truth. And we protect each other. Ethan nodded once, like that answer made sense. Then Annie said quietly, almost like she was talking to herself. Sometimes the people who hurt you are the people who think they own you. Daniel looked at her. And sometimes, he replied. Those are the people you have to stand up to first. He looked at his son, at Annie, at Lillian, at the small kitchen table where his life had just been put back together in a way he never expected. For 1 year, he had been visiting a grave. Now he was sitting in a small kitchen, planning how to go to war. The next morning, Daniel Carter woke up in a house that felt too big. He had slept in his own bed, under a high ceiling, in a room with glass walls that looked out over a quiet stretch of trees and a long private driveway. Everything was clean, polished, silent. The kind of silence money buys: thick carpets, insulated windows, rooms too large for sound to linger in. But when he opened his eyes, for a brief second, he expected to see a small desk by a window and a little boy bent over spelling homework. Then he remembered. Ethan was alive, and everything else in his life had just changed. Daniel sat up slowly and reached for his phone on the nightstand. He didn't check emails. He didn't check the market. He didn't check the messages from his assistants, his board, or the 3 missed calls from his sister that had come in late the night before. Instead, he opened his contacts and pressed one name: Michael Grant. The line rang twice. "Grant," the voice answered, rough and alert like the man never really slept. "It's Daniel," he said. A pause. "You don't call this early unless something's wrong." Daniel looked out the window, the morning light just starting to touch the trees. "I found my son," he said. Silence. Then Michael said, very slowly, "You're going to need to explain that sentence." "He's alive," Daniel said. "For a year, he's been alive. My sister and her husband told me he died. They buried an empty coffin." Michael did not speak for a few seconds. When he did, his voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a friend. It was the voice of a former detective. "Start from the beginning," Michael said. So Daniel told him everything. The cemetery, Annie, the photograph, the Millers, the orphanage, the lies. He spoke calmly, clearly, like he was presenting a case in a boardroom. But inside he could feel the anger moving slowly, like a storm that had not decided when to break yet. When he finished, Michael said one thing: "Do not call your sister." "I wasn't planning to," Daniel replied. "Do not confront them. Do not warn them. Do not let them know you know," Michael continued. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a family problem. This is fraud, kidnapping, falsifying medical records, falsifying a death certificate, and inheritance manipulation. This is prison-level crime, Daniel." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I thought so. You need proof," Michael said. "Not anger, not accusations. Proof, paper, signatures, money trails, hospital records, orphanage intake forms, funeral home contracts. Everything." Daniel nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. "Can you help me?" Michael let out a slow breath. "I was wondering when you were finally going to ask me to do something interesting again," he said. "Yes, I'll help you. I want everything," Daniel said. "I want to know who signed what, who got paid, who moved my son, who approved the death certificate, who authorized the burial. I want a timeline from the day I left for that business trip to today." "You're not just building a case," Michael said. "You're building a war." Daniel looked out the window again. "They started it," he said quietly. After he hung up, Daniel got dressed but didn't put on a suit. Instead, he put on jeans, a dark sweater, and a simple coat. When he walked into the kitchen, his housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, looked surprised to see him dressed like that. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. "Coffee?" "Yes, please," he said. "And Mrs. Alvarez, I'm bringing a child home soon." Her face softened immediately. "That is good news," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It is." He drove himself that morning. No driver, no assistant, just him, the road, and the address Annie had given him. As he drove through the richer part of town, then the older part, then the poorer streets near the Millers' neighborhood, Daniel thought about the last year of his life. The meetings, the flights, the deals, the empty house, the silent dinners, the grave. All that time, his son had been less than an hour away. When he pulled up in front of the blue house, Annie was already sitting on the front steps, like she had been waiting. She stood up when she saw his car. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Daniel replied. He walked up the steps and sat down beside her for a moment, instead of going inside right away. "Annie," he said, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him. "Why did you help my son?" Daniel asked. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. Why did your family take him in?" Annie thought about that for a moment, swinging her feet slightly above the ground. "My mama says when God puts a child in front of you who needs help, you don't ask where they came from," she said. "You just open the door." Daniel looked at the small house, at the crooked porch, at the chipped paint. "And you?" he asked. "Why did you help him?" Annie shrugged a little. "Because he looked like he was waiting for someone," she said. "I know what that looks like." Daniel didn't ask her what she meant. Some things you understood without people explaining them. After a moment, Annie looked at him and said, "Are you going to fight them?" Daniel knew exactly who she meant. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Good. Because my granddaddy says sometimes the only way to fix a wrong is to stand still and not move, even when the people who did it got more money than you." Daniel almost smiled. "Your granddaddy sounds like a smart man." "He is," Annie said. "He just never had money." Daniel looked down at his hands, then back at the house. "I had money," Daniel said quietly, "but I didn't have the truth." Then he stood up and looked toward the front door where his son was inside. Probably sitting at that same small table. Probably doing homework. Probably still trying to understand why his life had changed again. Daniel Carter had spent his whole life building an empire. But as he stood on that small porch again, he realized something he had never understood before. Money could build buildings, but it couldn't build trust. That, he was going to have to earn back one day at a time. When Daniel walked into the Miller house that morning, he noticed something different immediately. Ethan was laughing. It wasn't loud laughter, not the kind that filled a room, but it was real. He was sitting on the floor with Annie, and the two of them were building something out of old wooden blocks, some kind of crooked tower that kept falling over and being rebuilt again. Daniel stopped in the doorway and watched them for a moment without saying anything. For 1 year, he had imagined his son in a hospital bed, weak and fading, because that was the story he had been told. He had imagined machines, white walls, quiet beeping sounds, doctors with careful voices. Instead, his son had been here, sitting on a worn carpet, building towers out of wooden blocks, eating grilled cheese sandwiches, going to a small local school, living a life Daniel had never seen. And the strangest part was this. Ethan did not look like a boy who had been destroyed. He looked like a boy who had been hurt, but saved. Ethan looked up and saw him. He didn't freeze this time. He didn't look confused. He just said, "Hi, Dad." The word landed gently this time, not like a shock, not like a question, more like he had tried it in his head a few times and decided it was still true. "Hi, buddy," Daniel replied. Annie stood up. "We're building a city," she said, "but he keeps making the tower too tall and it falls." Daniel walked over and sat down on the floor with them, something he had not done in a very long time. "Well," Daniel said, picking up one of the blocks, "that's because when you build something tall, you need a strong base first. Otherwise it falls." Ethan watched as Daniel moved a few blocks around, widening the bottom of the tower. "Like that?" Ethan asked. "Like that," Daniel said. They built in silence for a few minutes, the three of them sitting on the floor in a small living room that smelled like toast and laundry soap. It was the quietest Daniel had felt in years. After a while, Ethan said, without looking up, "Are we going to your house today?" Daniel answered carefully, "If you want to come, see it, yes. But you don't have to stay there yet. We're not rushing anything." Ethan nodded, like that answer mattered. Annie looked at Daniel. "Is your house bigger than the grocery store?" she asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "Yeah, it's bigger than the grocery store." Annie's eyes widened. "That's too big," she said. "Nobody needs a house that big." Daniel laughed quietly under his breath. "You might be right." From the kitchen, Lillian watched them, leaning against the counter with her arms folded. She didn't interrupt. She just watched the way Daniel sat on the floor in his expensive coat, helping two children build a crooked wooden tower like it was the most important job in the world. After a while, Daniel stood up. "I need to talk to Miss Lillian for a minute," he said. Ethan nodded and kept building with Annie. In the kitchen, Daniel spoke quietly. "I talked to a friend of mine. He used to be a detective. He's going to help me investigate what happened. Legally." Lillian nodded. "That's good," she said. "Because what your sister did, that's not just wrong, that's evil." Daniel didn't argue with that word. "I'm going to have to talk to the police soon," Daniel said. "But before I do that, I need documents, proof. I need to know which hospital, which doctor, which funeral home, which orphanage. I need everything." "I kept the papers from the day we took Ethan to the clinic," Lillian said. "They asked for his last name. He said Carter. The nurse wrote it down. I didn't know then how important that would be, but I kept it anyway. Daniel nodded slowly. Good, he said. Very good. Lillian studied him for a moment. You're very calm, she said. Daniel looked at her. I'm not calm, he said. I'm focused. There's a difference. He paused, then added quietly. Angry men make mistakes. Focused men win. Lillian nodded slightly, like she understood exactly what kind of man he was. Back in the living room, Ethan had finally managed to build a tower that didn't fall. Annie clapped once like it was a big achievement. When Daniel walked back in, Ethan looked up at him. Can I bring my boat if I go to your house? He asked. Daniel looked at the small red boat sitting on the shelf. You should bring anything that makes you feel at home, Daniel said. Ethan nodded, walked over to the shelf, and picked up the boat carefully with both hands. I thought I lost this, he said. Daniel looked at him. I thought I lost you, he replied. Ethan looked at the boat, then back at Daniel. We both found something, he said. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest again, but this time it wasn't guilt. It was something like gratitude. Annie walked over and looked up at Daniel. When you fight your sister, she said, you gonna win, right? Daniel looked down at her. I don't know if winning is the right word, he said. What's the right word then? She asked. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. Truth, he said. I'm going to make sure the truth wins. Annie nodded like that answer made sense. Then she said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. My granddaddy says money can buy quiet, she said. But it can't buy right. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He had spent most of his life buying quiet. Lawyers, settlements, contracts, private agreements, problems that disappeared without noise. But this time, quiet was the one thing he did not want. This time, he wanted the truth to be loud. That afternoon, Daniel took Ethan to see the house. He didn't call it the mansion. He didn't call it the estate. He just said, let's go see where I live. Like it was something simple, something normal. Ethan sat in the front passenger seat, holding the small red boat in his lap the whole way. He didn't touch the radio, didn't ask many questions, just looked out the window as the streets slowly changed from small houses to bigger houses to long driveways and tall trees. When the car finally turned through the iron gates and began the long drive up to the house, Ethan sat up a little straighter. Do you live here alone? He asked. Daniel nodded. Yeah, just me. Ethan looked out the window again at the wide lawn and the tall windows. It's very quiet, he said. Daniel glanced at him. Too quiet, he replied. They parked in front of the house, and for a moment neither of them got out of the car. This is your home, Daniel said finally. Always was. I just didn't know how empty it was until you were gone. Ethan looked at the house, then down at the red boat in his hands. Can Annie come here sometime? He asked. Daniel smiled a little. Annie can come anytime she wants. They got out of the car and walked inside. Mrs. Alvarez was waiting in the front hall, her face warm and kind. You must be Ethan, she said. I've heard about you since you were very small. Ethan nodded politely. Yes, ma'am. Daniel noticed that. The manners, the way he answered, the way he held the boat carefully instead of dropping it somewhere and running off. The Millers had not just given him a place to stay. They had raised him. Would you like some hot chocolate? Mrs. Alvarez asked. Ethan looked at Daniel first, like he was checking if that was okay. That sounds good, Daniel said. While Mrs. Alvarez went to the kitchen, Daniel walked Ethan through the house slowly. He didn't show him everything at once. Just the living room, then the kitchen, then the stairs. At the end of the hallway upstairs, Daniel stopped in front of a door and opened it. This is your room, he said. The room had not been changed in a year. The same bed shaped like a small boat. The same bookshelf. The same framed drawing Ethan had made when he was 5 stick figures of him and Daniel standing next to a very large, very square house and a sun in the corner. Ethan walked into the room slowly, like he was walking into a memory. You didn't change it, he said. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. I couldn't, he said. I thought if I changed it, it would mean you were really gone. Ethan set the red boat down on the desk next to the bed. It looked like it had been waiting there the whole time. I think I want to sleep here sometimes, Ethan said, but I still want to go to Annie's house too. Daniel nodded immediately. Then that's what we'll do. Ethan looked around the room again, then asked, Are you really going to call the police? Daniel did not lie. Yes, he said. But first I have to make sure I have proof. When you tell the truth, you need proof so people can't pretend you're lying. Ethan thought about that. Like homework, he said. You have to show how you got the answer. Daniel smiled slightly. Exactly like homework. They went back downstairs, and Ethan sat at the kitchen counter drinking hot chocolate while Daniel stepped into his office and closed the door. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the room he had spent most of his life in. The desk, the screens, the deals, the contracts, the awards on the wall, the photographs from magazines, the proof of a life that looked successful from the outside. Then he picked up his phone and called his sister. She answered on the second ring. Daniel, Sarah said, her voice warm and relieved. I've been trying to call you. I was worried about you yesterday. I know this week is hard for you. The anniversary and all. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment when he heard the word anniversary. Sarah, he said calmly, we need to talk. Of course, she said quickly. Do you want to come to dinner this weekend? Victor's been asking about you. We're family, Daniel. We should be together during times like this. Family, the word sounded different now. I'll come by this afternoon, Daniel said. There are some things we need to discuss. About Ethan. There was a very small pause on the other end of the line. Most people would not have noticed it. Daniel did. That might be hard, Sarah said gently. Talking about him always upsets you. Yes, Daniel said. It does. Another small pause. But I think it's time we talk about what really happened, Daniel said. This time, the silence was longer. Then Sarah said, carefully, I don't know what you mean. Daniel looked out the window toward the long driveway, toward the gates, toward the world outside his house where, for a year, his son had been living without him. I think you do, Daniel said quietly. I'll see you this afternoon. He hung up before she could answer. Daniel stood in his office for a long moment, then looked down at his hands. They were steady. He realized something important in that moment. For 1 year, he had been a grieving father. Now he was something else. Now he was a father who knew the truth. And a man like Daniel Carter did not walk away from the truth. He walked straight toward it. Daniel arrived at his sister's house at exactly 4 in the afternoon. He did not bring a driver. He did not call ahead again. He did not bring lawyers. Not yet. Today was not about courtrooms or contracts. Today was about looking his sister in the eye and seeing if there was anything left of the person he used to trust. Sarah's house was large, but not like Daniel's. It was designed to look warm instead of powerful stone front. Wide windows, a swing on the porch, the kind of house that told the world a good family lived inside. Daniel parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front door. He remembered bringing Ethan here on Thanksgiving. Remembered Ethan running across this exact lawn. Sarah laughing. Victor standing by the grill with a beer in his hand, calling Ethan Champ. He remembered thinking, back then, that his son would grow up surrounded by people who loved him. He got out of the car and walked to the door. Sarah opened it before he knocked, like she had been watching from the window. Daniel, she said, and immediately stepped forward and hugged him. He did not hug her back right away. After a moment, he put his arms around her briefly, then stepped inside. Victor was standing in the living room, leaning against the fireplace like he owned the house and everything in it. Daniel, Victor said, smiling like nothing in the world had ever been wrong. It's good to see you. You should come by more often. Daniel looked at him for a long moment but didn't return the smile. We need to talk, Daniel said. Sarah nodded quickly. Of course. I'll make coffee. No, Daniel said. No coffee. No small talk. We talk now. Something in his voice made both Sarah and Victor go very still. They all sat in the living room. The same living room where they had celebrated birthdays and holidays and family dinners. Daniel looked around the room slowly, then back at them. I went to the cemetery yesterday, he said. Sarah's face softened immediately. She reached for his hand. Oh, Daniel. I know this week is hard. The grave is empty, Daniel said. The room went silent. Sarah's hand froze halfway to his. Victor didn't move at all. Daniel watched their faces carefully. Years of business had taught him how to read the smallest reactions, the flicker in someone's eyes, the tightening of a jaw, the delay before a response. Sarah recovered first. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice thin but controlled. I spoke to the groundskeeper, Daniel said. He's been working there for over 30 years. He told me the coffin you buried was too light. He told me you paid cash. He told me you told him not to open it. Victor let out a short laugh. You're going to believe a cemetery worker over your own family? Daniel didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Sarah. I also found Ethan, Daniel said. That was the moment everything changed. Sarah's face lost all color. Victor stopped smiling. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and quiet and more dangerous than if he had been shouting. He's alive, Daniel said. He's been alive this whole time, living less than an hour away. Sick, alone, thinking I didn't want him anymore. Sarah's eyes filled with tears instantly. Daniel, I can explain. Then explain, Daniel said. Victor stood up. You don't get to walk in here and accuse us. Daniel stood up too, and suddenly the room felt smaller. I'm not accusing, Daniel said. I'm stating facts. You falsified medical records. You falsified a death certificate. You buried an empty coffin. You put my son in an institution and told him I didn't want him anymore. Sarah began crying, real tears now, but Daniel did not move to comfort her. Why? Daniel asked quietly. Sarah covered her face with her hands. Victor spoke instead. You were never home, Victor said. You were always on a plane, always in a meeting, always chasing another deal. That kid was sick all the time. He needed someone there every day. And you weren't. So you kidnapped him? Daniel asked. We didn't kidnap him, Victor snapped. We moved him somewhere he could be taken care of. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere controlled. And the fake death? Daniel asked. Victor didn't answer immediately. Sarah lowered her hands and looked at Daniel, her eyes red. You were going to cut us out, she said, from the company, from the will. Victor saw the paperwork. When Ethan turned 18, everything would go to him. We would have nothing. Daniel stared at her. So you erased my son, he said. We didn't erase him, Sarah said quickly. We just moved him out of the way. For a while. We were going to bring him back later. We just needed time. Daniel felt something inside him go very cold. For a while, he repeated. He was supposed to stay in the facility until the paperwork changed, Victor said. But the kid ran. That part wasn't part of the plan. Daniel looked at him slowly. You lost my son, he said. Victor didn't answer. You told him I didn't want him, Daniel said. Sarah started crying harder. We had to make him stop asking for you, she said. He kept saying he wanted to call you. He kept saying you would come get him. We had to make him stop. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his voice was very calm. You didn't just lie to me, he said. You lied to a child. You let him believe his father abandoned him. For a year, neither of them spoke. Daniel walked to the door, then stopped and turned back to them. I'm not handling this as your brother, he said. I'm handling this as Ethan's father. Sarah looked up, her face pale. Daniel, please. I'm going to the police, Daniel said, and to my lawyers. And I am going to take back everything you tried to steal from me and from my son. Victor's voice hardened. You do that, and this family is finished. Daniel looked at him. No, he said quietly. This family was finished the day you buried an empty coffin. Then he opened the door and walked out. As he walked to his car, Daniel realized something with complete clarity. The man who had walked into this house an hour ago had come looking for answers. The man who was leaving was going to make sure there were consequences. Daniel did not drive home right away after leaving Sarah's house. He drove without really seeing the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind replaying every word, every pause, every look on Sarah's face when he said Ethan was alive. We just moved him out of the way. For a while, the sentence repeated in his head like a slow hammer. Not strangers, not criminals from the outside, not some faceless organization, his own family. By the time Daniel pulled into his driveway, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house looked the same as it always had, large, quiet, perfect, and for the first time in his life, Daniel understood that a house could look like success and still hide failure inside it. He went straight to his office and closed the door. He didn't take off his coat. He called Michael. Well? Michael asked as soon as he picked up. You talked to them? Yes, Daniel said. They admitted it. There was a pause on the line. They admitted kidnapping your son and faking his death? They didn't use those words, Daniel said. But yes, that's exactly what they admitted. Michael exhaled slowly. Good, he said. That helps. Helps? Daniel repeated quietly. Yes, Michael said. Because now we know we're not chasing a theory. We're building a case. Daniel sat down behind his desk. What do we need? Everything, Michael said. Start with the hospital that supposedly treated Ethan. We need medical records, doctor names, admission forms, discharge papers, signatures, then the death certificate who signed it. What doctor? What cause of death? Then the funeral home who ordered the coffin, who signed the burial authorization. Then the orphanage intake records, guardian signatures, payment records. Someone paid to put your son there. Institutions don't take kids for free. Daniel nodded slowly. Victor mentioned paperwork, he said. He said they needed time for paperwork to change. That means inheritance, Michael said immediately. Guardianship, trust control, company voting rights. If Ethan was legally declared dead, control of his shares and trust would move, probably to the closest adult relatives. Your sister. Daniel leaned back in his chair. So this wasn't just about me being a bad father, he said. This was about money. It's almost always about money, Michael replied. But what they did crossed from immoral into criminal very clearly. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I want to do this the right way, he said. Not just for me. For Ethan. One day he's going to ask what happened. And when he asks, I want to be able to tell him I didn't just get angry. I did something. Michael's voice softened slightly. Then we do it clean, he said. By the law. Paper first, police second, court last, and Daniel. From this moment on, you document everything. Every call, every conversation, every receipt, every memory Ethan has about that place. I understand, Daniel said. After he hung up, Daniel sat alone in the office for a long time. On the wall across from his desk was a framed magazine cover with his face on it. The headline read, The Man Who Built an Empire from Nothing. Daniel looked at it for a long time, then said quietly to the empty room, and almost lost his son while doing it. There was a soft knock on the office door. Daniel turned. Ethan stood there, holding the red boat. Mrs. Alvarez said I could come in, Ethan said. Of course, Daniel replied. Come here. Ethan walked into the office slowly, looking around at the large desk, the bookshelves, the city skyline visible through the glass wall. This is where you work? Ethan asked. Yes, Daniel said. Ethan nodded. It looks important. Daniel thought about that. It is, he said, but not as important as you. Ethan walked around the room, then stopped in front of the magazine cover on the wall. That's you, he said. Yeah, Daniel replied. Ethan studied the picture. You look serious there. I was serious, Daniel said. Ethan looked back at him. Are you serious now? Daniel thought for a moment before answering. Yes, he said. But for a different reason. Ethan nodded like that made sense, even if he didn't fully understand why. After a moment, Ethan asked, Are Aunt Sarah and Uncle Victor going to be in trouble? Daniel did not answer right away. He chose his words carefully. What they did was very wrong, Daniel said. They lied to you. They lied to me. They told people something that wasn't true and they signed papers that weren't true. When adults do that, there are consequences. Ethan looked down at the boat in his hands. Are they going to jail? Daniel leaned forward slightly. I don't know yet, he said honestly. That's not up to me alone. That's up to the law. My job is to tell the truth and protect you. That's my job now. And I'm not going to fail at it again. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. Okay, he said. He walked over and placed the red boat on Daniel's desk, right next to the stack of business files. You should keep it here, Ethan said, so you don't forget what you're working for. Daniel looked at the small red boat sitting in the middle of contracts, reports, and legal folders. For years, his desk had been covered with things that made him money. Now there was something on his desk that reminded him why money mattered in the first place. I won't forget, Daniel said quietly. Ethan nodded, satisfied, and walked out of the office. Daniel sat there for a long time, looking at the boat. Then he opened a drawer, took out a legal pad, and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. They buried an empty coffin and stole a year of my son's life. He underlined the sentence once, slowly. Then he turned the page and began to write a list of names. Sarah Carter, Victor Hale, St. Matthew's Hospital, Greenwood Funeral Services, Northridge Children's Home. When he finished writing the list, Daniel Carter understood something very clearly. This was no longer a family argument. This was a case. The next morning, Daniel Carter began building the case. Not with anger, not with threats. With paper. He sat in his office early, before the sun had fully risen. A cup of black coffee beside him and the legal pad from the night before open on his desk. The small red boat still sat beside the files, a bright piece of plastic in a world of contracts and evidence. At exactly 8 o'clock, Michael Grant walked into the office without knocking. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with gray hair, a lined face, and the posture of someone who had spent most of his life walking into bad situations on purpose. Michael looked around the office once, then at Daniel. "You look different," he said. "I am different," Daniel replied. Michael nodded, then sat down and opened a folder. "I made some calls this morning," he said. "Quiet calls, old contacts, people who owe me favors." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What did you find?" Michael slid the first paper across the desk. "St. Matthew's Hospital," he said. There was a file under Ethan Carter's name. Admitted for a respiratory illness. But here's the interesting part. The attending physician, whose name is on the file, retired 3 years ago. He wasn't even working there when your son was supposedly treated. Daniel looked down at the paper, his jaw tightening slightly. "So the medical record is fake," Daniel said. "Looks that way," Michael replied. "Either forged signature, or someone used his old credentials. Either way, it's illegal." Michael slid a second paper across the desk. "Death certificate," he said, "signed by a doctor who never saw Ethan. Cause of death listed as complications from pneumonia. Filed 2 days after the supposed date of death. The person who reported the death was Victor Hale." Daniel looked at the name for a long moment. "He signed my son's death certificate," Daniel said quietly. Michael nodded. "Yes, he did." The third document came next. "Greenwood Funeral Services," Michael said. "Closed casket burial, paid in cash. Authorization signed by your sister, Sarah Carter Hale. No viewing, no hospital body transfer record attached, which is very unusual." Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly. "They planned this," he said. "This wasn't panic. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned." Michael nodded. "Yes, this was planned." He then placed the last document on the desk. "Northridge Children's Home," he said. "Your son was admitted there 3 days after the death certificate was filed. Admitted under guardianship transfer papers signed by Sarah Carter Hale and Victor Hale. The reason listed: father deceased. Child requires long-term medical supervision." Daniel stared at the paper, reading the sentence again and again. Father deceased. They hadn't just erased Ethan. They had erased him too. "So legally," Daniel said slowly, "they declared me alive, and my son dead to the world, and dead to me." Michael nodded. "And then, they put him in an institution where no one would ask questions, because the paperwork said both his parents were gone." Daniel stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "For a year," he said quietly, "my son thought he had no parents, and I thought I had no son." Michael didn't say anything. After a long moment, Daniel turned back. "What's the next step?" Michael closed the folder. "Now we go to the police," he said. "But we don't just walk in and tell a story. We walk in with copies of all of this. Medical fraud, fraudulent death certificate, illegal guardianship transfer, child endangerment, financial motive tied to inheritance and corporate control. This is a major case." Daniel nodded once. "Do it," he said. "Are you ready for what happens next?" Michael asked. "Because once this starts, it doesn't stay private. There will be police, lawyers, courts, reporters. Your company board will find out. Your name will be in the news next to words like fraud, kidnapping, family betrayal." Daniel thought about Ethan sitting on the floor building a block tower. "Yes," Daniel said. "I'm ready." That afternoon, Daniel picked Ethan up from school. It was a small brick building with a playground that had seen better days. But when Ethan walked out and saw Daniel waiting by the car, his face lit up in a way that made every headline, every board meeting, every business deal in Daniel's life feel very far away and very small. "How was school?" Daniel asked as Ethan got into the car. Good, Ethan said. I'm ahead in spelling. Daniel smiled. I'm not surprised. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Ethan asked, Are you going to the police now? Daniel glanced at him. Yes, he said. Soon. Ethan nodded, like he had expected that answer. My teacher says if someone does something very wrong, you don't get to decide the punishment yourself, Ethan said. You tell the truth and let the rules decide. Daniel looked at him, surprised. Your teacher is a smart person, he said. Ethan shrugged a little. She says rules are there so strong people don't get to do whatever they want. Daniel was quiet for a moment after that. Strong people don't get to do whatever they want. For most of his life, Daniel had been one of the strong people. The kind of man who could make problems disappear with a phone call and a signature. But this time, he wasn't going to make the problem disappear. This time, he was going to make sure it was seen. When they got home, Ethan took the red boat and placed it on Daniel's desk again before going upstairs. Daniel looked at the boat, then at the stack of evidence Michael had left. For years, that desk had been where he made decisions that changed markets, companies, and careers. Now it was where he was going to make a decision that changed a family. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Michael had written down for him. Major Crimes Division, a voice answered. Daniel Carter looked at the photograph of Ethan on his desk, then at the red boat, and then straight ahead. My name is Daniel Carter, he said calmly. I need to report a crime. My son was declared dead last year. He paused, then said the words that made it real. And I have proof that he was alive the entire time. Daniel Carter had testified in courtrooms before, but never like this. He sat in a quiet interview room at the Major Crimes Division, a recorder on the table, a legal pad in front of him, and two detectives across from him, Detective Laura Bennett and Detective Sam Rodriguez. Michael Grant sat to Daniel's right, silent, watchful, saying nothing unless necessary. Detective Bennett clicked on the recorder. Interview with Daniel Carter. Regarding the falsified death report of Ethan Carter. Mr. Carter, please state your full name for the record. Daniel Robert Carter, he said calmly. Mr. Carter, she continued, you are here to report that your son, Ethan Carter, who was legally declared deceased last year, is in fact alive. Is that correct? Yes, Daniel said. That is correct. Start from the beginning, Detective Rodriguez said. Tell us when you were informed your son died. Daniel folded his hands on the table. His voice was steady, controlled, but every word carried weight. I was in Frankfurt on a business trip, he said. My sister, Sarah Carter Hale, called me and told me my son had developed severe pneumonia and passed away in the hospital. She told me the situation happened very quickly and that she and her husband, Victor Hale, had handled the hospital paperwork and funeral arrangements because I was out of the country. Did you see your son's body? Bennett asked. No, Daniel said. I was told the casket was closed due to the condition of the body. Rodriguez and Bennett exchanged a look but said nothing. Daniel continued. For the next year, I believed my son was dead. I visited the grave regularly. Last week, I was approached at the cemetery by a child who told me my son was alive. The cemetery groundskeeper then informed me that the coffin buried in that grave was unusually light and that my brother-in-law had insisted on a sealed burial and paid in cash. Bennett leaned forward slightly. And that led you to investigate? Yes, Daniel said. With the help of Mr. Grant, we obtained records from the hospital, the funeral home, and the children's home where my son was placed. Michael slid copies of the documents across the table. Bennett opened the folder and began flipping through the papers. Rodriguez read over her shoulder. After a few minutes, Rodriguez looked up. These signatures, he said, tapping one of the pages. Victor Hale signed the death certificate notification. Yes, Daniel said. And these guardianship transfer papers, Bennett added. Signed by Sarah Carter Hale. Yes, Daniel said again. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. Mr. Carter, do you understand what you're accusing them of? This isn't just fraud. This is kidnapping, identity fraud, falsifying a death certificate, illegal guardianship transfer, and possible financial fraud tied to inheritance and corporate control. Daniel met his eyes. Yes, he said. I understand. Bennett closed the folder slowly. Where is your son now? He is safe, Daniel said. He is staying with a family who took him in after he ran away from the institution where my sister and her husband placed him. Do they know you're here? Rodriguez asked. Yes, Daniel said. They want to help. Bennett nodded. We will need to speak with them and with Ethan. Gently. This will involve child services as well. But given the circumstances, this is not a case against you. From what we can see so far, you were a victim of fraud as well. Daniel didn't react to the word victim. He didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a father who had been late. What happens now? Daniel asked. Bennett folded her hands. Now we open an official investigation. We will obtain warrants for the hospital records, the funeral home records, and the children's home. We will also bring your sister and her husband in for questioning. Based on what we see here, this is a very serious case. Rodriguez added, Mr. Carter, I'm going to be very direct with you. Cases like this usually take months to build, but because there is a child involved and a falsified death certificate, this will move faster than most. Daniel nodded once. Thank you, he said. After the interview ended, Michael and Daniel walked out into the hallway. You did exactly right, Michael said quietly. Calm. Clear. No exaggeration. Juries trust men who sound like you sounded in there. I'm not thinking about juries, Daniel said. I'm thinking about my son. Michael nodded. Good. That's why we'll win. They stepped outside into the late afternoon light. For a moment, Daniel just stood there on the steps of the police building, looking out at the street, at people walking past who had no idea that his entire life had been rebuilt in the last few days. You know what the hardest part is? Daniel said after a moment. What? Michael asked. I keep thinking about that day, Daniel said. The day Sarah called me and told me Ethan died. I was standing in a glass office in another country, looking at a city I didn't care about, talking about a deal I don't even remember now. And my son was alive somewhere, probably asking for me. Michael didn't say anything. I built a life where I could be everywhere except the place I was needed most, Daniel said quietly. Michael looked at him. Then build a different life now, he said. That evening, Daniel picked Ethan up again and brought him back to the big house. They ate dinner in the kitchen, not the dining room. Mrs. Alvarez made chicken, rice, and vegetables, and Ethan told Daniel about school, about a math test, about how Annie said she wanted to see his room again because she still didn't believe a kid could have a bed shaped like a boat. After dinner, Ethan sat at the kitchen table drawing with a pencil, while Daniel read through more documents Michael had sent over. After a while, Ethan looked up and asked, Did you tell the police? Yes, Daniel said. Are they going to help? Ethan asked. Yes, Daniel said. That's their job. Ethan nodded and went back to drawing. A few minutes later, he got up and walked over to Daniel and handed him the paper. It was a drawing of 3 houses. One small, one medium, and one very big. There were stick figures standing between the houses holding hands. This is Annie's house, Ethan said, pointing to the small one. This is Aunt Sarah's house, he said, pointing to the medium one. Then he pointed to the big one. This is your house. Daniel looked at the 3 houses connected by 3 small stick figures. Where are we? Daniel asked quietly. Ethan pointed to the space between all 3 houses where the stick figures were standing. Here, he said. We're supposed to be here. Not in just one house. Daniel looked at the drawing for a long time. A child had just explained family better than any lawyer ever could. The call from Detective Bennett came 3 days later, just after sunset. Daniel was in his office, reading through financial reports he no longer cared about. When his phone rang, Ethan was upstairs with Mrs. Alvarez, working on homework. The house was quiet in that familiar way, but now the silence didn't feel empty. Now it felt like a pause between chapters. Daniel Carter, he answered. Mr. Carter, this is Detective Bennett, the voice said. We've brought your sister and Victor Hale in for questioning. Daniel didn't speak immediately. He had been waiting for this call, but now that it came, he felt something heavy settle in his chest. And? He asked. They both lawyered up, Bennett said, but we executed warrants this morning. We have the hospital records, financial transfers, and administrative records from Northridge Children's Home. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What did you find? We found payments, Bennett said, large ones. A trust account connected to your family company transferred money to a private medical administrative service. That service produced the false medical file. Another payment went to someone at the children's home who pushed the guardianship paperwork through without proper review. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. It was worse than he thought. Not just a lie. A system of lies. Mr. Carter, Bennett continued. This was planned in advance. Your sister and Victor Hale began moving money and preparing documents 2 months before your son was declared dead. 2 months, Daniel repeated quietly. Yes, Bennett said. We also have emails between Victor and a lawyer discussing temporary control of shares and trust assets in the event of Ethan Carter's death. The timing matches exactly. Daniel looked over at the red boat on his desk. They were planning my son's death while he was still alive, he said. I'm sorry, Bennett replied. But yes, that's what it looks like. Daniel was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. But there was something unbreakable in it now. What happens next? He asked. We are recommending charges, Bennett said. Kidnapping, fraud, falsifying a death certificate, unlawful guardianship transfer, financial fraud, and child endangerment. The district attorney is reviewing the case, but with this amount of documentation, it will move forward. Daniel nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see him. Thank you, Detective. There's one more thing, Bennett said. Your sister asked if she could speak to you. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. No, he said. Then after a pause, he added, not yet. After he hung up, Daniel sat in his chair for a long time without moving. 2 months. They had planned it while Ethan was still alive, still playing with his toys, still waiting for his father to come home from work trips. There are moments in a man's life when something inside him changes permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet shift where forgiveness becomes something different than forgetting. Daniel picked up the red boat and turned it over in his hands. You waited for me, he said quietly, as if Ethan could hear him from upstairs. Now, I'm here. There was a knock on the office door, and Ethan stepped in holding a math worksheet. I finished, Ethan said. Mrs. Alvarez said you were on the phone. I was, Daniel said. Come here. Ethan walked over and climbed into the chair across from the desk, the way he used to when he was smaller. Was it the police? Ethan asked. Yes, Daniel said. Ethan watched his face carefully. Are Aunt Sarah and Uncle Victor in trouble now? Daniel chose his words carefully again. Yes, he said. They are. Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't look happy. He didn't look sad. He just looked like he was thinking. Are you mad? Ethan asked. Daniel thought about that question for a long time before answering. Yes, he said. I am. But I'm not doing this because I'm mad. I'm doing this because what they did was wrong. And if people do something very wrong and no one stops them, they might do it again to someone else. Ethan considered that. Like rules, he said again. Rules are there so people don't hurt other people. Yes, Daniel said. Exactly like that. Ethan looked at the red boat in Daniel's hands. I used to talk to that boat, he said. Daniel looked up. You did? Yeah, Ethan said. At the place with the white walls. I used to tell it that you were going to come get me. I told it you were just busy and didn't know where I was. Daniel felt his throat tighten, but he didn't look away. What made you keep believing that? Daniel asked quietly. Ethan shrugged a little. Because you promised me you wouldn't disappear, he said. And you never lied to me before. So I figured something else must be wrong. Daniel looked down at the boat again, then back at his son. You were right, Daniel said. Something else was wrong. Ethan nodded, satisfied with that answer. Can Annie come over this weekend? Ethan asked. She's never seen a movie on a big TV. Daniel smiled a little. Yes, he said. Annie can come over this weekend. Ethan nodded and hopped down from the chair. Before he left the room, he turned back and said one more thing. Dad? Yes? I'm glad you didn't stop looking, Ethan said. Daniel watched him leave the room, then looked down at the boat in his hands again. The truth was, he had stopped looking. He had believed the papers, believed the signatures, believed the coffin, believed the stone with his son's name on it. He had stopped looking because the world had shown him official documents, and he had trusted them more than his own instincts. But a little girl in a cemetery had not believed the stone, and because of that, his son was home. Daniel set the red boat back on the desk and looked out at the darkening sky beyond the glass windows. Money, power, contracts, influence, he had spent his whole life believing those things made a man strong, but he knew now that strength was something simpler, Strength was a little girl telling a grieving father the truth when no one else would. Strength was a family that took in a sick child without asking for anything in return. Strength was a 6-year-old boy who kept believing his father would come, even when the world told him otherwise. Daniel Carter had spent his life building an empire. Now he was building something else, a family that no one would ever be able to steal again. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Daniel had expected it, but that didn't make it easier when Michael walked into his office holding a tablet and said, "It's public." Daniel took the tablet and looked at the headline. Local business heir declared dead, found alive, aunt and uncle under investigation. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then handed it back without saying anything. "It's going to get loud now," Michael said. "Reporters, calls, board members, people pretending they always cared about you." Daniel nodded once. "Let it get loud," he said. "The truth should be loud." Upstairs, Ethan was getting ready for school. Mrs. Alvarez was helping him pack his bag, and Annie was sitting at the kitchen counter eating toast because she had slept over the night before. It had been the first time she had ever slept in a house that big, and she had spent most of the morning walking around quietly, touching things like she was in a museum. "Your house echoes," Annie told Daniel when he walked into the kitchen. "That means it's too big," Daniel replied. She nodded seriously. "Yeah, houses shouldn't echo. Houses should sound like people." Daniel poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "You're probably right," he said. Ethan came into the kitchen with his backpack. "Mrs. Alvarez says reporters are outside," he said. Daniel looked at him. "They are," he said. "They're going to be outside for a while." "Are they going to ask me questions?" Ethan asked. "No," Daniel said immediately. "They don't get to talk to you. You're a kid. Your job is to go to school, do homework, and be 6 years old. My job is to deal with everything else." Ethan nodded, satisfied with that answer. Annie looked at Daniel. "Are you famous now for the wrong reason?" she asked. Daniel almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "Probably." Annie thought about that while chewing her toast. "My granddaddy says you find out who people really are when something bad happens and everyone is watching." "That's a smart man," Michael said from the doorway. Daniel grabbed his keys. "I'll take you two to school," he said. When they pulled out of the driveway, there were already 2 news vans parked across the street. Cameras turned as soon as his car appeared, but Daniel didn't slow down and didn't look at them. He just drove. At the school, he walked Ethan to the door. Annie ran ahead a few steps, then turned around and waited for them. Ethan looked up at Daniel before going inside. "Are you okay?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Are you?" Ethan nodded back. "Yeah," he said. Then he added, "You don't look sad anymore." Daniel thought about that. "I'm not sad," he said. "I'm focused." Ethan smiled a little. "You say that a lot." "Because it's important," Daniel replied. After they went inside, Daniel stood there for a moment watching the school doors, then turned and walked back to his car where Michael was waiting. "The board wants an emergency meeting," Michael said. "They're worried about the company being connected to a criminal investigation." Daniel nodded. "Of course they are," he said. "They're not worried about my son. They're worried about stock prices." "That's the world you built," Michael said, not unkindly. Daniel got into the car. "Then I'll deal with the world I built," he said. The board meeting was exactly what Daniel expected. A long table, expensive suits, carefully chosen words that sounded supportive but were really about risk, liability, and public image. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Daniel, we are very sorry for what happened to your son. Truly. But we have to consider the company. If this turns into a criminal trial involving your family, the press could damage investor confidence." Daniel looked around the table slowly. "For a year," he said. "My son lived in a small house with a family that had almost nothing, and they fed him, took care of him, and protected him without asking for a single dollar. That's what people with nothing did." The room was very quiet. Then Daniel continued. "Now I'm sitting in a room full of people with everything, and the main concern is investor confidence." No one spoke. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Let me make something very clear," he said. "If this company cannot survive the truth, then it does not deserve to survive. I am not protecting the company at the cost of my son. Not now. Not ever." One of the older board members, a man who had known Daniel for 20 years, nodded slowly. Then we stand with you, he said. Because if we don't stand for something like this, then what exactly are we building here? That changed the room. Not everyone agreed, but no one argued after that. When Daniel walked out of the building, there were reporters waiting outside. Cameras turned toward him, microphones raised, voices calling his name. Mr. Carter, is it true your sister faked your son's death? Mr. Carter, did you know about the inheritance changes? Mr. Carter, do you have a statement? Daniel stopped on the steps and turned toward them. For a moment, the noise continued. Then he raised his hand slightly, and the crowd went quieter. Daniel Carter looked at the cameras and said calmly, clearly, so there would be no misunderstanding. My son was declared dead while he was still alive. For a year, he believed his father didn't want him, and I believed my son was gone. What happened was not just fraud. It was not just a crime. It was a betrayal of a child. I am not here today as a businessman. I am here as a father, and I will make sure the truth is told, and I will make sure my son is safe. Everything else is secondary. He paused, then added one more sentence. Some people tried to bury my son with paperwork and a coffin full of lies. They forgot one thing: he was still alive. That night, when Daniel got home, Ethan and Annie were sitting on the floor again, building that same wooden block tower. This time, the base was wider, and the tower did not fall. The trial began in early spring. By then, the story had spread far beyond the city. News stations, newspapers, and online headlines had turned the Carter family into a public story. Money, power, betrayal, a missing child who had never really been missing, and a little girl who had told the truth when no one else had. Daniel did not try to stop the attention anymore. He had learned something over the past few months. Silence protects the wrong people. Truth protects the right ones. On the first day of the trial, Daniel held Ethan's hand as they walked up the courthouse steps. Annie and her grandfather George stood a few steps behind them, along with Lillian Miller. They were not dressed like the people going into the building, no expensive suits, no briefcases, but Daniel knew they were the most important people there. You don't have to come inside, Daniel told Ethan gently. You can stay with Annie and Mrs. Miller. Ethan shook his head. I want to go in, he said. I'm not scared. I just want to sit with you. Daniel looked down at him and nodded. Okay, he said. You sit next to me. Inside the courtroom, Sarah sat at one table with her lawyer, her eyes tired, her face pale in a way Daniel had never seen before. Victor sat beside her, still in an expensive suit, still trying to look confident, but there was something different about him now. He looked like a man who had run out of moves. When Sarah saw Ethan walk into the courtroom, she started crying immediately. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears she couldn't stop. Daniel did not look away, but he did not comfort her either. The trial lasted 3 days. Doctors testified that the medical records had been falsified. The funeral home director testified that he had been paid in cash and instructed not to ask questions. An administrator from Northridge Children's Home testified that special payments had been made to rush the guardianship paperwork through. Bank records showed money moving from accounts connected to Sarah and Victor to the people who had helped create the false documents. Then George testified. He walked slowly to the stand, wearing his best jacket, the one Annie said he only wore to church and funerals. The prosecutor asked him, Mr. George, how long have you worked at the cemetery? 32 years, George said. And in those 32 years, have you buried many coffins? Yes, ma'am, George said. More than I can count. On the day Ethan Carter was supposedly buried, did you notice anything unusual? George looked across the courtroom, then spoke calmly. Yes, ma'am, he said. That coffin was too light. I remember because I thought to myself, that's not the weight of a child in there. That's the weight of something else. But I was told not to open it. And sometimes poor men keep their jobs by not asking rich people questions. The courtroom was completely silent. Then Lillian testified. She told the story of finding Ethan behind the grocery store, sick and alone. She told the story of the first bowl of soup. The first night he slept without waking up scared. The way he kept saying his father would come. Finally, Daniel testified. He sat in the witness chair, hands folded, voice calm. The prosecutor asked, Mr. Carter, what was the hardest part of the past year for you? Daniel thought for a moment before answering. The hardest part, he said slowly, Was believing my son died thinking I wasn't there because I didn't love him. I can live with losing money. I can live with losing business. But I could not live with my son believing I didn't come for him. He paused, then added quietly, "What my sister and her husband didn't just try to take my company. They tried to take my son's place in the world. They tried to erase him, and they tried to erase me from his life." On the third day, the verdict came. Guilty. Fraud. Falsifying a death certificate. Illegal guardianship transfer. Financial fraud. Child endangerment. Conspiracy, Sarah cried. Victor just stared straight ahead like he was still trying to figure out how he had lost. Daniel did not feel happy when he heard the verdict. He felt something quieter than that. He felt finished. A week later, Daniel, Ethan, Annie, George, and Lillian stood together in the cemetery, the same cemetery where this story had truly begun. Daniel stood in front of the headstone with Ethan's name on it. For a year, this stone had been the symbol of his worst day. Now it was the symbol of the biggest lie of his life. Ethan stood next to him, holding the red boat. "Can we take it down?" Ethan asked, looking at the stone. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. George had brought tools. Slowly, carefully, he removed the headstone from the ground. Underneath it was only dirt. Empty earth, nothing else. Daniel looked down at the empty space for a long moment. "For a year," he said quietly, "I thought my son was under this ground. But he wasn't. My son was waiting for me." He looked at Annie. "And if it wasn't for you," he said, "I might have never known." Annie shrugged a little, uncomfortable with too much attention. "I just told the truth," she said. George rested a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do," he said. Daniel looked at the empty grave one last time, then took Ethan's hand. "Let's go home," he said. They walked away from the grave together, Daniel, his son, the little girl who had saved his family, and the two people who had taken his son in when the world had turned its back on him. As they reached the gate, Ethan looked up at Daniel and asked, "Is it over now?" Daniel thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "It's over." Then he looked down at Annie walking beside them and added softly, more to himself than to anyone else, "No, it's not over. It's just the part where we start living again." This story reminds us that money, power, and success mean very little if we fail the people who love us the most. Daniel Carter built a powerful life, but he almost lost his son because he trusted documents more than his own heart, and trusted the wrong people just because they were family. The story teaches us that evil does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who sit at our own dinner table, but it also teaches us something else. Kindness often comes from the people the world does not notice. A poor family saved a rich man's son, and a little girl told the truth when all the adults were silent. In the end, this is a story about justice, but more importantly, it is a story about love, responsibility, and second chances. Because at the end of the day, success is not measured by how much money you make, but by how many people you refuse to give up on. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.